Good afternoon. Welcome to the International Conference, Gender Security and Development, Revisiting the Nexus in Turbulent Times. This conference is organized by the Portuguese National Defense Institute. I'm the director of the Institute. I'm really happy to welcome you all. And UNITAR, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. Allow me to start by saluting Dr. Evariste Carambize, Director of UNITAR's Peace and Rule of Law Division, as well as other UNITAR team members who are here with us this afternoon. Afternoon in Lisbon, morning in the United States. A warm welcome to our guest speakers and chairs who generously agreed to join us this afternoon and to all the participants online. A word of thanks also to Professor Cristina Rodrigues da Silva, coordinator of this conference, as well as the IDN support team. This conference signals the official start of IDN and UNITAR's institutional cooperation, aimed at developing common projects and training programs in areas such as international security and development, crisis management, conflict resolution, and the construction of peace. We believe this partnership will enable us to significantly increase our outreach to new audiences across the globe, connecting people, institutions, and ideas with enormous multiplying effects. We share the same goal of empowering people through knowledge, providing the grounds for a better understanding of conflict and peace dynamics, strengthening citizenship, and supporting decision-making. But this conference also signals our common concern and interest in the gender dimension of security and development processes, on the role of women and men in transformative action towards building equality. The relevance of the conference's topic is dramatically emphasized when a new war is about to change the face of Europe, impacting the lives of millions, as well as the material and cultural foundations of our societies. As always, the gendered expression of war and conflict emerges clearly from the ongoing events in Ukraine and will certainly continue to be salient. From the gendered roles in war to the varying degree to which men and women, boys and girls are exposed to violence and their different security needs, to the economic and social consequences of war, displacements and refugee movements, or the war narratives and its gendered meanings in the first place. Although growing attention has been directed to gender and security studies scholarship in the past, the nexus between gender, security, and development remains a relatively devalued topic. Yet, different studies, among which some groundbreaking conducted by Professor Valerie Hudson and their colleagues, show that instability, violence, conflict, and state fragility are strongly correlated with the subordination and oppression of women in the respective societies. This work has shown that economic performance, governance, health, food security, or environmental protection are significantly associated with gender dynamics. Likewise, scholarship on gender and security, namely abundant work on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, has highlighted the close interconnections between gender, war, and peace, and the importance of women's equal and full participation as active agents in all phases and at all levels of conflict resolution. How does such knowledge affect the way security and defense institutions are run in democratic societies? Allow me to share with you some thoughts on this specific dimension of the nexus. which will be analyzed, of course, from a variety of other angles throughout this conference. In my view, there are at least three challenges to the promotion of equality agenda in this realm of security and defense. The first challenge is to explain the relevance of gender equality. As weird as it may sound to say this in 2022, it is exactly because this is 2022 and such relevance is not always acknowledged that it is still critical to value the need to explain it. And there are different reasons why gender equality is relevant to security and defense institutions. And it is necessary, I believe, to recall them, either because equality still needs to be fully implemented, or because history shows that setbacks exist and past successes should not be taken for granted. The first reason is political. Formal and substantive equality is a democratic principle that underlines the rule of law and the values that sustain it. Why would we leave women out of the social compact of citizenship that is bearing the same rights and responsibilities as men? Why would we refrain from using the talent of the population in confronting threats and promoting security? Armed forces and security forces must be able to respond to their functional imperative of producing security without losing sight of the fundamental values of the societies they serve and which pay for their existence. The second reason is organizational. Diversity is vital for the effectiveness of organizations. Counting on multiple perspectives, experiences, and visions is the basis for innovation and creativity. And the ability to innovate is the basis for resilience, that is, adapting to changes in the strategic context. Organizations that remain monolithic will wither and die. The third dimension, or reason, is functional. Security and defense institutions have been expanding their range of missions in increasingly complex contexts, interacting with multiple actors in the field. That range of missions calls for a varied set of skills, from the most classical ones related to combat to those required by processes of conflict prevention and resolution, mediation, humanitarian intervention, and peace support. They will need diversity to better face these multiple scenarios. The second great challenge I was referring to is to develop policies to reduce inequality, nothing new. But this involves ensuring that legal and normative restrictions are lifted and that women will be present in security contexts. It is often said that increasing the number of women does not necessarily entail change in the structural causes of inequality. That more important than counting women is to make them count, that it is not enough for them to sit at the table, they need to be heard. In sum, that formal equality is a necessary but not sufficient condition for effective equality. Accepting this should not imply, however, that formal equality is downplayed. Inequality cannot be reversed without one being among those who define the alternatives. A politics of presence is vital. But of course, the structure of incentives that prevents women from being present will have to be changed. For that, we need better communication, instruments for work-family conciliation, mentoring and training programs, preventing harassment and providing opportunities for people, men and women, to develop their full potential. And of course, this might be different challenges in different parts of the world. The third and last challenge I would like to mention has to do with a potential clash between discourses that are used to legitimize new roles for women and the conditions for their full and equal participation as agents of international security. Especially in the context of peacekeeping missions, new roles and opportunities for women emerged with underlying advantages. Women's presence has been considered crucial from a practical and strategic point of view, and this comparative advantage has been attributed to their ability to control aggression and conciliatory attitude. There is a problem with this rhetoric. These arguments, once used to exclude women from security contexts and institutions, are now used to require their inclusion. New opportunities for them are legitimized by a discourse that conforms to traditional stereotypes, which may jeopardize at least part of previous achievements. It is important to reassess the discourse and admit that if skills associated with conflict mediation, empathy, conciliation, or communication are essential to the effective performance of security institutions, they can and should be promoted equally among men and women. And finally, we need to abandon the idea of a gender-neutral approach. Promoting gender equality cannot equal making gender invisible. On the contrary, it involves recognizing the multiple and ways in which gender inequality is produced and legitimized, subtly or explicitly, in society as a whole and in each organization. Building gender equality in the security sector does not mean eliminating differences. It is about empowering equally different people. But for diversity to be valued, it is essential to manage it, integrating women, but allowing or disregarding the existence of resistance and stereotypes that prevent their full access destroys cohesion. Promoting training for gender equality without attention to the operational context in which security organizations operate is counterproductive. Having instruments and policies for integration without winning the hearts and minds of commanders and middle-range leaders for this effort is inconsequential. On this note, allow me to finish by paying a tribute to all scholars, political decision makers, security sector authorities who have been stepping forward in this respect, sometimes facing walls of resistance and prejudice. Some of them are here today as speakers and attendees to this conference. Thank you all for your presence and commitment. I wish us all a wonderful and fruitful conference. And without further ado, I would give the floor to Dr. Evariste Carambize, Director of UNITAR's Peace and Rule of Law Division, for his initial remarks. Dr. Carambize, the floor is yours.
I thank you very much.
We can hear you, but we cannot see you. Maybe your video is off.
It was connected, but now
now it's
I'm
okay.
struggling. It's connected.
Go ahead.
But I'm using my phone. If you don't see me, then
Okay.
apologize. The conditions that I'm operating in are not the optimum. So if any technical problem with a lot of noise around me, so I beg your pardon and understanding.
Okay, thank you.
Having said that, I'm still really struggling. Give me 1 minute to...
Take your time, it's okay. We have
Yeah.
7 more minutes for you to intervene.
So. Do you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Plus some. Yes, I think now I'm ready. Do you see me because I'm using the phone? Maybe when.
We cannot see you, but that is okay. Don't worry. We can hear you. That is.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Carreras. My apologies for all these delays and other technical issues. The topic we are, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The topic we are looking at today is of high interest and for sure top priority for all security organs, top priority for politicians and scholars. Thank you to all of you for joining this very important event organized by the Defense Institute of Portugal. And it's an honor for UNITA and myself to join the event today. Focusing on gender and security and development is more than a triple nexus. Increasingly, the full, equal, and the meaningful participation of women in peace process, peacemaking, peacekeeping, peace building efforts is a key priority for United Nations, and in particular for the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. A lot of resolution since 2000, after the key major resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, there is a series of many other resolutions. It's not lack of resolutions, it's not lack of Secretary General reports, concept papers, it's not lack of scholars' papers, it's a willingness and a collective determination to make what is in the papers, in the research papers, to make what is in the Security Council resolutions a reality. Today, the participation of women and peace, peace and security development is not a favor. It's a reality. Women, girls are key players to make a better change, to shape a better world. Every one of us can make a testimony on that, particularly that we have been raised by our moms. They know better the dimension, the social, psychology, dimension of a human being. Why shall we exclude them today when it comes to tackle serious issues for a better world? I don't believe that anyone is aiming. We do mistakes by not knowing, by not paying attention. But I'm sure we all agree that women are key players. I would say even the most important players to shape a better world. I will not go through all the resolutions that have been drafted by the United Nations. There is a tons of speeches. There is tons of papers research findings, recommendations. I believe today is time to move into action. In this regard, UNITA's activities is framed around 5 priorities for the implementation of the World Peace and Security Agenda. Gender sensitive political and conflict analysis, promoting inclusion and women meaningful participation in all peacemaking and peace building efforts, women's participation in electoral and the political process, preventing and addressing conflict-related sexual violence as a priority for peace, and last but not least, programmatic ensuring gender mainstreaming in all projects through resource allocations, gender makers, and tracking. Allow me to conclude saying that UNITA, as a reliable partner, stand ready each time that there is an opportunity to contribute to make the women participation effective in promoting peace and security and development, to make it effective. Allow me also to thank all panelists and attendees from across the globe for your active interests and involvement to advance and to gender security and development. Allow me also to thank our privileged partner, the Defense Institutes of Portugal, and all my colleagues who contributed directly or indirectly to this event. To all of you, I will end my short remarks by asking not to take this as another event, but a call to action, where each of us leave this event with the determination to make women real actors, to make women contributors to a better world. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Karambisi. It was great to have you, and we overcame the technical issues and listened very well to your message. I will immediately give the floor to the chair of our first panel. There were some changes due to timetable constraints on part of some speaker, but we managed to rearrange and he will explain. So please, the floor is yours, Dr. John Hans Koster, Senior Specialist and Team Leader of Online Learning and Education at UNITAR. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Carreras. And let me just allow me just to also thank Mr. Everest Karambisi, who's actually in the field in Africa, and that he was able, even though there were challenges, that he was still able to connect and to join us today and to deliver his powerful message, which resonates with what this whole online conference is about, is that we need to do more in integrating and delivering for women when it comes to the realities of war. But we have excellent panelists, and your excellencies, research fellows, faculty, members of the armed and security forces, ladies and gentlemen, friends and peers. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this really important must-have discussion. We kindly invite you to please use the chat, and as the panelists and the first two panelists will do their presentations, and engage with us, I would kindly ask you, if you have specific questions for them, I would kindly ask you to pop it in the chat box, and then I would, time permitting, at the end of our session, I would then gladly pose your questions to our panelists. So let's start then by focusing on panel one, understanding the link between gender, security, and development. And it's our deep honor to present to you Professor Valerie Hudson. She's the University Distinguished Professor and holds the George W.H. Bush Chair in the Department of International Affairs of the Bush School of Government and Public Affairs at Texas University, where she directs the program on women, peace, and security. An expert on international security and foreign policy analysis, as well as gender and security. She received her PhD in political science from the Idaho State University. Valerie is one of the principal investigators of the Women's Stats Project, which includes the Women's Stat database, the largest, most comprehensive data and statistics and maps on the status of women worldwide. She has authored numerous publications, including co-authored books. Let me just mention to you a few of them. The First Political Order, How Sex Shapes Governance and National Security Worldwide, published by Columbia University Press in 2020. Sex and the World Peace, published by Columbia Press in 2012, and the awarded book Bare Branches, The Security Implication of Asia's Surplus Male Population, published by MIT Press in 2004. Professor Hudson was named to the Foreign Policy magazine's top 100 most influential global thinkers list for 2009. She has received significant research grants, including grants from the US Department of Defense's Minerva Initiative and the National Science Foundation. Professor Hudson's research and teaching experience is complemented by 3 major teaching awards, and she has been recently awarded the Andrew Carnegie Fellowship. Professor Hudson serves as Vice President of the International Studies Association during 2011 and 2012. Professor Hudson, we are delighted to welcome you as a panelist. Let me also introduce the second panelist, Ms. Monica Ferro. Ms. Ferro is Director of the United Nations Population Fund, UNPA, office in Geneva since April of 2017. She has worked to promote equality, development, and human rights for the past 20 years. Prior to joining the United Nations Population Fund, Ms. Ferro has a 20-year career of dedicated public service in Portugal, during which she served as the Secretary of State for National Defense, as a university lecturer, a media personality, and an engaged activist. She served as a member of the parliament and was vice president of the parliamentary group of the Social Democrat Party, chair of the all-party parliamentarian group on population and development, and vice president of the European Forum of Parliamentarians for Population and Development. Ms. Ferro is the founding partner of the 2015 Objective Association, the United Nations Millennium Campaign, the Portuguese United Nations Association, the founding member of the PD Factor Association for Cooperation and Population and Development. Monica has also been a lecturer at the University of Lisbon, guest lecturer at the National Defense Institute, the Air Force Academy, and the University of Military Studies. Furthermore, she is an associate researcher at the Center for Gender Studies at the University of Lisbon, and has been a columnist for several national newspapers and magazines, and have authored a number of articles entries in encyclopedias, book chapters on the United Nations focusing on development cooperation, human rights, security sector reform, and gender equality. She holds a bachelor and a master's degree in international relations from the Higher Institute of Social and Political Science, the University of Lisbon, and she's currently completing her PhD with her thesis focusing on security sector reform in fragile states. Ms. Farrow, we also use this opportunity to wish you much success with the completion of your PhD. So without any further ado, Professor Hudson, you have the word.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm thankful to the sponsors of this conference for engaging such an important topic. I'm going to show a short PowerPoint, and let me arrange that. Here we go. All right. Wonderful. All right, I'd like to talk to you as a scholar about some of the linkages that researchers have found between what's going on with women and also what's going on with nation states, particularly in terms of security, stability, and development. Let's see if I can get these slides to turn. I'm excerpting this brief presentation from a much longer work called The First Political Order, How Sex Shapes Governance and National Security Worldwide. So if you're interested in the things that I'm talking about today, and of course it's abridged by necessity, I was told to limit my remarks to 20 minutes, which is so difficult for a professor. As I'm sure you remember from your own university days, but I'm going to do my best. But if you want to know more, this is the book to find. I think there has been a recognition that what's going on with women really does have something to do with what's going on with nation states. I love this quote from Ambassador Anwaro Chowdhury, who was President of the Security Council when UNSCR 1325 was passed in the year 2000. He has this wonderful quote: "We should remember that without peace, development is impossible. Without development, peace is not achievable. But without women, neither peace nor development is possible." So I think there is this growing recognition. We see it also echoed in this wonderful quote by Don Steinberg. Compare those societies that respect women and those which don't. Who's trafficking in weapons and drugs? Who's harboring terrorists and starting pandemics? Whose problems require US troops on the ground? There's a one-to-one correspondence. Don't tell me there's no relationship between national security and the empowerment of women. But that aside, we'd like to talk here about whether there's any evidence for those assertions. And so my colleagues and I began our project by asking ourselves whether it was possible to see relations between men and women as establishing, if you will, the very first political order in any society. We believe that the character of that order molds the society, its governance, and its behavior. Sometimes I will say to my classes, let's pretend we're in a video game design class instead of a political science class. So I want you to create a game. And the only two parameters I'm going to give you is that we have players that are roughly two groups that are roughly half of the group of players, and that if they don't figure out how to cooperate, those two groups don't figure out how to cooperate, there is no second round. The game ends. And so my students often come back and say, well, you haven't told us enough. And I say, well, what more do you want to hear? And they ask me questions, which are all very political questions. So do these two groups stand before each other as equals or as superior and inferior? Are decisions for the group made by one of these two subgroups or by both together? If there are conflicts between the interests of one group and another, are those conflicts resolved peacefully or by force and domination? And lastly, the queen of political questions, How are important and valuable resources distributed among the two groups? Are they distributed equally, or does one group have greater claim and capability to extort resources from the other? So these are all very political questions, and we assert that their answers establish that first foundational political order within a society. And that foundational order then will bleed over into what's considered normal governance, normal conflict resolution, normal resource distribution, and even consideration of who is part of the group and who is not part of the group. So my research team and I were interested in analyzing in a more empirical fashion what happens when you subordinate women. So as was mentioned, we were given a 4-year, $1.5 million grant from the US Department of Defense to actually investigate this as comprehensively as possible. So we operationalized subordination against women, and we didn't operationalize it in a usual fashion. Usually women's empowerment is measured by looking at things such as literacy and educational attainment, labor force participation, representation in parliament. But we all viewed those things as downstream from the first political order, which is established between men and women within the households of the nation. We have found, for example, that there are nations that may subordinate women that have high levels of female educational attainment, such as Saudi Arabia. Other nations with high female labor force participation, but a subordinate status for women, such as we see in the Philippines. And even high parliamentary representation for women, yet coupled with a subordinate status for women, such as we see in Rwanda. So we were interested in taking it down to its roots. And here we're talking about the actual mechanisms by which women are subordinated. So of course, the level of violence against women, violence in all its forms, would be an extremely important part of this root of the sexual political order. Sex ratios, whether the lives of girls and women are devalued relative to those of men. Inequity in family and personal status law. For example, in many societies, it is very easy for a man to divorce a woman, but almost impossible for a woman to divorce a man. Custody laws may follow. Sometimes a woman's citizenship, her very citizenship, is dependent upon the citizenship of her father or her husband. So looking at this sort of inequity kind of tells you about the mechanisms by which women are subordinated. And then last but certainly not least, looking at marriage customs, age of first marriage, where the bride price or dowry are expected, whether the marriage is patrilocal in nature, where the bride moves to the groom's family's compound, cousin marriage, polygyny, variety of different marriage customs that can be used to subordinate women. And of course, property and inheritance rights for women. Do women inherit equally? Are women able to hold land in their own name and make contracts and take out loans in their own name and so forth? So these are really the linchpins of what we would consider to be the ground where women are subordinated. Well, it took us 3.5 years to operationalize all those variables, and we ended up with a 16-point scale. It was not possible to map all 16 colors, so I've given you here a 5-point scale that looks at the countries of the world. Now, even those darker green countries where the subordination is not very present, all still have fairly high levels of violence against women. For example, my own country, the United States. So certainly do not interpret dark green as being some sort of paradise for women. That's not the case. But we can see that there are other nations, particularly in orange and red, where the subordination of women is much more explicit, much more systematic in terms of rules and laws and marriage customs and so forth. So with this grant, which we had from 2014 to 2018, we took this operationalization of the subordination of women at the household level, and then our statisticians then related this operationalization of the subordination of women to 9 different dimensions of national security. So we were interested in indicators of political stability and form of political governance. We were interested in security and conflict, economic performance and rentierism, interested in health and well-being indicators, demographic indicators, looking also at the education of the population, social progress, and environmental protection. Because it's often been noted that the way that a society treats women is usually of a type with how society treats Mother Earth, because the Earth is conceptualized in feminine terms for the most part. Our statisticians chose multiple regression with 7 control variables to control for alternative explanations. And we used a very stringent bar for significance. Those of you who are statisticians, our cutoff point for significance was 0.001. We also were interested in looking at a wide variety of nations. So we looked at 176 nations, all nations that have at least 300,000 population. The outcome variables that we looked at were many and varied. We looked at 161 outcome variables in all. And I certainly don't expect you to read that whole list, but we were ensuring that we were not, in a sense, cherry picking particular variables that we thought would support our case. We looked at a wide variety of outcome variables. We were able to reduce them to 122 through factor analysis, but it was still an immense effort that took us 1.5 years after we had operationalized our subordination variable to actually finish this research. So what did we find? Well, we found that across our 22 measures of political instability and freedom versus autocracy, the most determinant and significant predictor of those outcome variables was our measure of women's household disempowerment, which had the largest effect size in the model, 100% of model runs. Conflict and insecurity, 70% of the model runs found that women's subordination was not only very significant, but also had the largest or second largest effect size. Political terror, 100% of the model runs. So your chances of experiencing terrorism are much higher the worse that women are treated within your society. Economic performance, about 62.5% of the model runs found that women's household empowerment or disempowerment is significantly related to economic performance. Public health, a little over 70% of the model runs. And this is, of course, fairly intuitive. Women are often given the highly gendered task of taking care of the health of family members. And so if you disempower women, you are, of course, going to have a hit in terms, or take a hit in terms of your health and well-being. Environmental preservation, I was surprised how strong the relationship was, but it is very strong. In 85.7% of the model runs, we found that women's household disempowerment was both significant and most determinative. Demographic security, again, 85.7% of the runs. Educational attainment, 60%. Social progress, 75%. So across all model runs, the syndrome was significantly related, the syndrome variable of the women's household disempowerment was significantly related at the 0.001 level in 90 of the 122 runs, or 73.8%. So in effect, then, what we're saying is that the odds of having a worse outcome as a nation state increase in lockstep with how poorly women are treated. So if you take the syndrome variable, which is our measure of the subordination of women, for every step worse on that 16-point scale, you have twice the chance of becoming a fragile state, 3.5 times the chance of having a government that is more autocratic, less effective, and more corrupt, 1.5 times the chance of being unstable and violent, 1.28 times the chance of experiencing terrorism, 1.4 times the chance of the country being poor and in economic decline, 1.5 times the chance of having a low GDP per capita, 1.5 times the chance of having low environmental quality, almost twice the chance of having a high fertility rate, almost twice the chance of a higher incidence of preventable deaths, and almost twice the chance of scoring far worse on the global hunger index. So subordinating women is really a trap, right? While many societies are based on the subordination of women, with the idea that subordinating female interests to male interests is the proper and most efficient way of running a society, what we find, on the contrary, is that subordinating women clearly, significantly, and recognizably leads to national insecurity and instability and lower levels of development. What we find in those societies is that governance is then devolved to males in largely kin networks. And such governance leads to unfortunate outcomes for the group: instability, violence, terror, corruption, and autocracy, because it's built upon households with domestic instability, domestic violence, domestic terror, domestic corruption, and domestic autocracy. And in fact, it is true that the first political order between men and women, established between men and women, right, will determine the destiny and the horizons for your nation state. There are other ramifications of those characteristics. Your nation state will also experience poor health, food insecurity, low economic performance, rentierism, demographic woes, and lack of attention to environmental security. So if there's only one takeaway from this presentation, it would be what you do to your women is what you do to your nation state. And if you curse your women, if you subordinate your women, then you'll curse your nation state as well. We get these results, we believe, because of 3 causal pathways. First of all, I think fairly obviously, there is a boot camp effect taking place. There is no better training camp for political violence and instability than lived domestic terror perpetration, lived domestic corruption and exploitation, and lived domestic autocracy. You are training members of every household, you're training children in the efficacy of these things. Secondly, we've discovered that subordinating women through systematic means also creates chronic structural goads to engage in political violence. In our book, we focus primarily on inflationary bride price, prevalent polygyny, and sex ratio alteration as 3 structural instabilities within a society that embraces those types of practices. And lastly, of course, you're disempowering women. That is, the very individuals whose influence could profoundly challenge the calculus of political violence and argue for a different set of priorities. So women are not the canary in the coal mine. Sometimes when I present this research, people will say to me, well, what's happening with women is like the canary in the coal mine. which refers to the practice of coal miners taking little birds, little canaries, into the mines. And as long as the bird was alive and chirping, the air quality was good. But when the air quality turned poisonous with carbon monoxide, the first to die would be the canaries. And then the miners could view this and quickly exit the mine. So some people are suggesting here, you know, that there is this larger cause, right? That maybe lack of democracy or lack of wealth that's causing women to be treated badly. Women are the canary in the coal mine. But that's not true, right? The coal mine, as we have seen from this research, is male-female relations. And when those have a highly exploitative and violent character, the canaries that are keeling over dead, that should tell you something's wrong, are poverty, malnutrition, ill health, explosive violence, and other problems. This, we think, is the conceptual difference wrought by seeing women using the Women, Peace, and Security framework. Or as Secretary of State Hillary Clinton put it back in 2012, the subjugation of women is a threat to the common security of our world and the national security of our country. So what I'd like to do is end my presentation there. And of course, we can talk about any of these points, and I can elaborate on any of them in our discussion. If you'd like to take a look at the types of data that we've collected, feel free to go to our database, which is online and is freely accessible, the WomenStats Project at womenstats.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Hudson. Some really powerful evidence and facts that we are, when we talk about the question of women, how it crosses the different stratosphere, not just of society, but it even goes as far as national security. I have three questions that I would like to pose to you, Professor Hudson, that was posed by panelists, but and members from the audience. But Justin, for the sake of time, if you would allow me, I am going to give the word to Ms. Ferro, and then I will pose you the questions afterwards. Thank you so much. And again, we kindly ask the panelists, as Ms. Ferro presents her precious thoughts with us, again, we would ask you to post some of those challenging questions in the chat box. Thank you. Ms. Ferro, you have the word.
Thank you, John Hans. And I can also take easy questions. They don't have to be particularly challenging. Thank you. I would like to start by thanking the director of the Institute for National Defense, Professor Helena Carreiras, for the very kind invitation and for also bringing another voice of the UN to these conversations. And it's quite interesting because I was going to start with a quote also on security and development. But I think that the quote we just heard from the professor is much more compelling, because I was going to quote the secretary, the state secretary for international development of the UK in 2004, when he was saying, the truth is, development without security is not possible. Security without development is only temporary. But I think it makes all the sense that we really place women squarely in the center of the conversation. And of course, we are talking about gender, as we've heard, and we are talking about gender roles. We are talking about constructive roles. We are talking about socially attributed roles. And sometimes they are built on social norms. And sometimes it kind of looks daunting, just thinking, how can we transform this social norms? How can we break the barriers and deconstruct the myths of that lead to the scenario that we just heard of a subjugation of women, and more than that, the waste of such human potential that could be used to leverage development and the promotion of human rights. And of course, we are talking about how to integrate this and deliver for women. And the truth is that our society still is very much focused on women's reproductive roles and in reducing women and girls to their reproductive roles and not acknowledging that their well-being and their full participation in all processes, be it political, be it economic, be it social, are at least as deserving as the ones that we always open for men and boys. And for that, we do have the data. And Professor just shared with us an incredible amount of data that help us to not only build that picture, but also understand what are the entry points for us to work on that syndrome, as she was calling. And the truth is that if you look at the both conflict situations, both development situations, what you will find is always this underrepresentation of women or their subjugation into what some societies or some speakers from those societies would call their traditional roles, but it's actually not allowing them to take full partnership, to take full presence in public space. And of course that, I work for the United Nations Population Fund, so we are constantly advocating for removing all the barriers that prevent women from accessing their sexual reproductive health and rights, from accessing their full potential, from living in a world with full gender equality. And this speaks very clearly to what we've just heard. We are talking about not allowing women not only to control their own bodies, and this is why our latest report last year was dedicated to bodily autonomy, the possibility that women have to control their own fertility, to take one of the most life-changing reproductive decisions, which is to decide if you want to get pregnant or not, and how this trickles down and impacts throughout her entire life, and how some of the things that we also heard that happen to women even before their reproductive years are really limiting in what comes to their options, what comes to their choices. And I think this is a conversation that needs to take place in all types of settings. This is not only a personal issue, this is a health issue, this is a human rights issue, and this is a societal and global issue. So when we talk about it here in Geneva, we focused a lot on the challenges, as we've heard in the initial remarks, on the challenges of implementing resolutions such as the Women, Peace and Security. And I do also believe that we have a fair amount of resolutions that could help us guide the way. But when we look at how these resolutions have been used and the outcomes they've produced, what we see is that between 1992 and 2019, women were on average just 13% of all negotiators of peace processes, 6% of mediators, and only 6% of signatories in major peace processes worldwide. And 7 out of every 10 processes did not include any women mediators or women signatures. If you look at the 4 UN-led or co-led peace processes in 2020, 2 were led by women mediators, and all these 4 processes consulted with civil society and were provided with gender expertise. So we see the shifts. In 2020, also women represented about 23% of conflict party delegations in UN-supported peace processes, a share that would have been lower without persistent measures by the UN. Also, the percentage of peace agreements with gender provisions was 20.6% in 2020, which remains below the peak of 37.1% in 2015. And also research shows that peace agreements that mention women, girls, or gender, they often arise at the comprehensive agreement stage. None of the ceasefire agreements reached between 2018 and 2020 included gender provisions or the prohibition of sexual violence. And this is something that we should really consider how we can change this narrative and how we can further include women in these processes. Another thing that I would like to highlight and falling from the conversation we were having before, the resolution on women, peace and security, it has been mentioned, all its 4 pillars, the pillar on prevention, on protection, on participation and peace building, and also on recovery, and all the 9 subsequent resolutions, they all focus on women's rights, on the human rights of women, and also on the leadership of women, both in prevention and in the response phases. And especially if you look at resolution 2493 from 2019, member states, they agreed to promote the human rights of women in conflict and post-conflict situations. So it's very interesting to try to understand how this perception that women are a critical component of the security dimension of global affairs, how then that is translated into practice. And there was also a very interesting report, a global study on the implementation of resolution 1325 that spoke to the centrality of women's human rights to peace and security, and what role human rights bodies have in securing accountability for women's rights in conflict and in conflict-affected settings and post-conflict. And so the Human Rights Council has decided also to engage in this conversation, making sure that we understand this is not a social norm that we are discussing. We are discussing human rights. We are discussing the participation of women in conflict prevention, in conflict resolution, and in peace building efforts. But we are also discussing, this within the framework of human rights. So what we've been seeing here in Geneva on human rights related issues to start with, and I will talk about health and economic empowerment just later on. What we saw was that several human rights mechanisms have really focused on this. One of the mechanisms was been quite active on this promotion of women's rights in conflict settings is universal periodic review. For some of you who are not familiar with what universal periodic review, it's a mechanism by which every member state of the United Nations gets their legislation and their programs on human rights reviewed every 4 years. So it's a peer-to-peer review. The countries who are under review get recommendations made by the other countries of the UN system. And once these recommendations, and don't get misled by the word recommendation, because once these recommendations are done and accepted, they become mandatory. So the word recommendation is at the beginning of the process, starts with the recommendation. But out of these recommendations on the last cycle, the 3rd cycle, which means 4 years of analysis, 500 recommendations address the issue of human rights of women and girls in conflicts and post-conflict situations. One of them even mentioned the national action plans for 1325, and many of them mentioned gender-based violence and trafficking. They also mentioned the right to participate in political and public life, and other issues that were less referred were the need to secure healthcare and the access to healthcare and services, and also education and empowerment. Within the other human rights mechanisms, there was also the special procedures, the several independent experts and rapporteurs that the Human Rights Council has in its very complex human rights machinery. There have been several reports mentioning these rights, the human rights of women and girls in conflicts and post-conflict situations. And some of the human rights investigative bodies have also dedicated their fair amount of time to this. So, and some of the key findings is that there's the need for an enhanced integration of the human rights of women and girls in conflict and post-conflict situations, that there is the need for greater attention to the intersectionality of compounding discriminations as women and girls with disabilities in conflict and post-conflict situations, internally displaced, older persons, and also the need to adopt the gender analysis and transitional justice mechanisms. And also the report mentions several of the remaining gaps that are hardly ever addressed in conflict and post-conflict situations, such as the right to food, adequate housing, education, health, including sexual reproductive health and rights, equal participation in economic life, and also not enough attention given to the result of the diversion of arms and illicit arms transfers and its impact on human rights. So there's a multitude of research done. There's a multitude of, sorry, I just saw on the chat, there's congratulations on the way to Helena Carreiras. But there's a multitude of research done and of evidence gathered that really shows that women have remained pretty much invisible when it comes to their human rights and the role they can play not only in security but also in development. We've been clearly advocating since the beginning that if you allow me to use very lame terms, that you cannot afford to neglect the potential and the power of half of your population, which is roughly the average of the women's population in the world. And it's such a waste of potential. And more than that, some of these resources could be easily tapped into if you just stopped discrimination, if you just ended gender inequality. So it's even if you want to, it sounds a dire endeavor because we are talking about social norms. But the beauty of social norms is that they are constructed, they can be deconstructed with data, with evidence. And there's also the need to understand that investing in women is actually investing in the country, is investing in a whole of society. And I'm just going to highlight 2 points, and then we can take the questions, which is far more interesting than listening to me. But when we talk about women's empowerment, we are talking not only about their participation in the development processes, we are talking about women's access to education, to training, but also women's access to sexual reproductive health and rights. A woman who cannot control her body can control very little of her life. Last year, the annual report of UNFPA was on bodily autonomy. And we asked women just 3 simple questions. Can you control going to a doctor, seeking healthcare? Can you control which type of family planning method you want to use? Can you say no to sex? And the numbers are just dire. Only half the women who were inquired respond yes to the 3rd question. So how can we presume we will build an inclusive society, a society that aims to tap into the resource of women for gender, for security and for development, if we don't even allow them to control their body and their fertility? And also when it comes to recognizing or to acknowledging, that investing in sexual reproductive health and rights and investing in human rights, it's a key that unlocks the potential of a woman, a family, of a society. It requires investment. It requires investment in education, it requires investment in training, but it requires mostly a shift in mentality and not seeing women as only with reproductive roles. I know that some of you will dispute what I'm saying, but the truth is that if you look to some of the practices that the professor has mentioned right before I stepped in, they are based on a very reductive role assigned to women, a very important role, but a role that doesn't require them to tap into all the other areas of personal development and intellectual development, political participation. So just to wrap up, the idea of investing in women for development, the idea of investing in women for security, it's because we need to see that there's this symbiosis between both sides of the same coin, both sides of security and development, because one without the other will never exist. And the actor that can play with both sides of this coin are human beings, are men and women, are boys and girls. And this is why neglecting one big part of that population, it not only undermines the efforts that you are taking in promoting peace and in promoting development, but it so creates a prosperous field for which the seeds of instability, of the seeds of conflict to be seed. And I think that there is something that's quite basic about all of what I'm saying. We are talking about human rights, and the full recognition of this, it's what will unlock this conversation and understand that women play a critical role in promoting security and in promoting development, not only because they bring a different agenda to the table, they bring different concerns to the table, but because they are the most severely impacted by the lack of development and the lack of security. They are also the ones who fight the most, to struggle the most to maintain peace and to secure development. And there's also ample evidence that I can share with you from our 130 country offices on how we see the difference of having women as politicians, of having women as implementers of projects, of having women as advocates. And this is probably a very simple message, but it's what we see every day from our work in the field. And now, Jon Hans, all the challenging questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. I am absolutely confident that there is no such thing as a challenging question, because as we said in the opening question, these are some of those hard discussions and direct questions that we must address. So I'm going to ask both of you to respond. And if we can start with Professor Hudson. One of the members from the audience said, okay, very well. We seem to focus a lot of discussion around women. But when we talk about the nexus, what about the agender, the transgender, and the novi gender people? What can be done to ensure that they are also included and protected in the nexus?
Thank you. I notice in the chat, do we have a new defense minister of Portugal? Is that correct? Is that not true?
I'm going to make a risk here and to say that the president will address the nation to announce it. But we also know that we have a number of people who knows. So I think just for us to follow due protocol, let's wait for the president to address the nation.
Wonderful. Well, congratulations anyway from someone who probably won't be watching the president's address. That is just awesome. And we will certainly be putting that fact into the Women's Stats database. Yes, certainly. Fortunately, laws in most countries, at least most Western countries, have a full civil and economic rights protection for those who do not correspond in traditional form to the gender binary. What we find, though, is that it is the most highly misogynist societies, those that subordinate women the most, that are most recalcitrant at granting such civil and economic rights. Because how you treat the first other, which is woman, is how you treat all others, whether those be those of different sexualities, different ethnicities, different religions, different languages, and so forth.
Thank you so much, Professor Hudson. Ms. Ferro?
Well, the truth is that we see gender as a broad spectrum definition, and And when we advocate for gender equality, we are very cognizant that we are talking about all dimensions, although in some of the conversations, we are actually talking about women. And it's very important that this reference that doesn't get diluted, because it's very critical to maintain the word women when we are advocating for certain services, when we are advocating for certain rights. Although, as I was saying, it's very clear for us that when we advocate for gender, we advocate for all gender identities, and we advocate with the same passion. And I think that's an important thing, because we are talking again about human rights. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you very much. If I may just add, because within the United Nations, we use gender as a definition as any harm or suffering that is perpetrated against a human being, a woman, a girl, a man, or a boy, and that has a negative impact on the physical, the sexual, and the psychological health, development, or the identity of the person. Now, based on the statistics and the evidence that we have, that was shared with us, is that the cause of the violence that is then directed towards women is indeed founded in the gender-based inequalities and the gender-based discrimination. And it is indeed why there is such an urgent need to really look at the evidence in front of us, and that women continue to be the victims. And yet we also have the evidence to see the fundamental value and the role women can play in peace processes. And this brings me to the next question that was asked by the chair of the second theme, and that is, and again, if I could maybe start with Monica and then ask Professor Hudson to follow up. How do you see the correlation between women's economic empowerment, but also their political and social rise in our respective communities and societies?
Well, it's very much interlinked. Without economic empowerment, what we see is that without economic empowerment, women don't get a voice at the public space. If they don't, or if they have a voice, it's seen as less authoritative within families, within society. So, and I'm going to say something that's quite debatable. But the truth is that women who are economically empowered and contribute to the family income, they are much more respected, not only within their families, but also within their communities. And I know that the unpaid work that women perform in a much bigger percentage than men has to be appraised, but it has also to be given a number. And you know, I'm sorry, in my past, when I was in Portugal, there was something that I was always very clear. You know, the unpaid work has to be paid, has to be remunerated, even if not for what we are discussing, participating in social life, or being acknowledged as someone who has an authoritative voice, also for pension effects. And we just had in Portugal, there was just a case in court on that, about a woman who worked in-house for her life, unpaid work. And when she got a divorce, she challenged her husband for pension because of that. So she wanted a value to be put to her unpaid work. And I think, but the question here is, of course, there's a link, and fully empowered women have a much stronger voice, and they lead political advocacy efforts, and political parties need to respond to those claims. But this would take another conference to address.
Thank you so much, Ms. Farrow. Professor Hudson?
Yes, I think Ms. Farrow has accurately painted the picture. Political power has always derived from two sources. In the past, it has arisen from physical power. Whose army is able to beat whose other army? Whose clansmen are able to defeat physically what other clans? But in the modern day, what we find is that political power is correlated tightly with economic power. For example, in the United States, you basically cannot run a successful campaign for the US Congress unless you are a multimillionaire. And that means then, I think that helps explain why only 25% of the US Congress is female. Is because men dominate in the economic sphere. And in a sense, what Ms. Farrow said about unpaid labor is accurate. Men, this is generally speaking, have throughout history been able to access free reproductive and productive labor from women in a way that men have never been able to, women have never been able to access from men. And so as a result, you have a situation in which men are rewarded economically for their labor, but women by and large are not economically rewarded for their labor. So if economic power is what produces political power within a society, women are structurally disadvantaged from seeking political position. But I do want to underscore that so far, what we found is that simply having political power may not necessarily, simply holding a parliamentary seat may not necessarily translate into real power as well. Sometimes it does. Right, what we see in the Nordic countries, almost 40 to 50% of their legislators are women, and certainly women's priorities, their concerns are taken into account. But we do have other nations, such as Rwanda. We even call it the Rwanda paradox, where I think it's 61 or 62% of their parliament is women, and that has not translated in any way, shape, or form to a better situation for women on the ground. So I would say there's a variety of interesting things with regard to women's political power that we could discuss. We could talk about the difference between first generation women leaders and second generation women leaders. How first generation women leaders often felt they had to out macho male leaders in order to hold their own. Whereas second generation female political leaders have drawn upon the differences between male priorities and female priorities, between male concerns and female concerns, in order to demonstrate why they should be given political power, that they would bring a different perspective. I'm very interested to see what the third generation of women political leaders will be like. So there's a whole variety, an interesting constellation of dimensions of the relationship between women and political power that we could discuss. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have 5 minutes left, and I'm going to throw one more question to both of you, if I may. And that is, a question was posed to say, how do we then also engage when so much of this gender discrimination that are taking place in certain traditional and patriarchal societies based on very rigid social, cultural, and religious pressures, where women themselves reinforce the bias and the exclusion of women, and what can be done to tear these down? Professor Hudson?
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. If every single woman rebelled, especially if they rebelled in solidarity, these structures would not stand. They would not stand for a day. But clearly within a patriarchal system, women are given a lose-lose choice, right? Which is that they can achieve a measure of safety, a measure of well-being, if they uphold the system. They will be protected as the quote unquote good women of the system by those with patriarchal power. Your other choice is to rebel and to face ostracism and perhaps even overt violence. So you can either abandon the quest for your rights, or you can face the onslaught of male and even female social backlash, shall we say. So it's no wonder that we haven't seen women sort of rise up in solidarity and say, to heck with this. I think that's very true. But I have seen, and what I'm thinking about kind of deeply at the moment, is how we are seeing a global rebellion of women against the world that men have made. And that is, if you will, a global birth strike, which is across the countries of the world. Birth rates are falling. With the exception of sub-Saharan Africa, they are all now basically below replacement rate. And there are many, many, many reasons for this. But isn't it true that in a sense, this is a sign that women are saying, we don't like the world that the men have created? I'm interested to see what the implications of that are for the future. And certainly one of the things that some countries are paying attention to is how the current modern workplace has made motherhood irrational, absolutely economically and socially irrational. So attempting to rationalize reproduction, of course, is one way that policymakers can look at this question. But I think it's a much broader question than simply the rationalization of reproduction. I think there's also a sense in which we don't like the world that our children would have to live in, and that we are looking for different kinds of power and governance to create a world that we would be happy to see our children live in. I'll just put that out there.
Thank you very much for those powerful words, Professor Hudson. Ms. Ferro?
Couldn't agree more. And I think I'm just going to add that what is often perceived as women endorsing certain processes, it has to be seen as the result of a certain socialization process. Do women really have a choice in some of these processes? And let me just tell you two very different, short and different examples that I just witnessed. So I was in a panel now on CSW, on the Commission of Status of Women, to discuss the rights of older women. And one of the women was sharing that she went to the doctor and she told the doctor that she had a certain pain. And the doctor very calmly told her, oh, you're not sick, you're just old. And because she has a lifetime of accepting discrimination, being undervalued, she just accepted it, which, to be honest, wouldn't be acceptable for the majority of older men. So, but it has to do with this socialization, how you are taught to behave as a woman and what you endure through your lifetime. A completely different story is from Kenya. Last November, I went to see our project on FGM, and I went to this community where we spoke with men, boys, and former cutters and former child brides. And we were talking about female genital mutilation, but also child marriage. And so there's a man that tells me, you know what? I told my wife, I don't want our daughter to be cut. And it was my wife that said, no, our daughter has to be cut. And I asked him, are you teasing me? Do you have the evidence for that? And he had his wife and he called his wife. And it was absolutely true, because that woman had been taught, she had been socialized, that for her to be married, for her to be able to cook during certain days, for her to be in certain places, she needed to be cut. So she didn't think she had an option. And so when she was getting ready to do it to her daughter, it's because she clearly doesn't know there's an option. If you think this is how the whole world behaves, there's no option for you. So this is why awareness raising and even panels like this one are such a fundamental part of the conversation. And this is why part of the training has to be to unbreak, first to shed light into all these realities, and then to unbreak this myths. And I'm sorry, I know we shouldn't talk about such daunting challenges with two small stories, but I think they are so revealing of the processes women go through their whole lives with its compounding discriminations, that some of the things just become like acceptable. It's the way of the world. But I also think that society is changing, and it's changing really fast. And I have a 16-year-old at home that confronts me every day with the future I want to see. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to conclude, and I would like to loop back what Her Excellency Ms. Carreiras was saying in the beginning, and that is that UNITAR and the National Defense Institute is in a unique position to continue to support the gender, peace and security training and development initiatives, given our broad mandates to contribute to gender equality and human security. Our collaboration in the future will focus on direct support, the integration of gender equality into our respective training and development programs, targeting peace, security, and those policy dialogues focusing on women as a priority, peace processes, and the security incentive and investment that would come from that. I'm going to hand you back to Her Excellency, and I just wish to thank everybody again, Professor Hudson and Ms. Ferro. Thank you so much for some of those facts, some of your wisdom, some of your experience, your research, but also allow me to thank our audience who is connecting from all corners of the globe. And for those of you that posted questions, my apology that we couldn't deal with all of them. Thank you so much. Your Excellency, it's back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jonas. This was amazing. Just want to thank again Monica Ferro, Very Hudson. It was wonderful. And thank you all also to the participants for the debate. I welcome already Anna Gomes and Catherine White, who are with us and will be the speakers in our next panel, which we'll have in a few minutes at 4:45 here in Lisbon. We have a short break now, and we stay tuned because we will be back soon. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful, wonderful panel. We'll keep your words with us and have them help us with our actions in the future. Thank you. See you in a minute. So welcome back. It's time for us to start the second panel of this conference, implementing strategies to reinforce the gender security nexus. I welcome all those who have just joined us, and we immediately give the floor to Lucia Morales, who will chair this session. Thank you also, of course, again to Catherine White and Ana Gomes, who are the speakers for this panel. Thank you. Lucia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Firstly, again, welcome everyone and for staying in our second panel. I think we moved from a very kind of powerful session with very inspiring discussions and very interesting questions. And we have now two panelists. I think it's a great honor to have both of you, and I will follow the introduction as Johannes did. So I will give a little bit your biography, then we move with your presentations, and then I will moderate the questions. So as you can see in terms of the program, we have the pleasure to have Ana Gomes and Catherine White with us. And again, just looking at the biography of Ms. Gomes is just like outstanding in terms of her career and her kind of service, is we said that way, in terms of the public approach that you have taken over your extensive career. So Ms. Gomes was a member of the European Parliament for 3 terms between 2004 and 2019. She's also was a member of the Portuguese Socialist Party and the SID Socialists and Democrats group. She served as the Foreign Affairs Committee, Development Committee, Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, and in the Subcommittee for Security and Defense and Subcommittee of Human Rights. She was a member of the Delegation for the Relations with the United States and the Delegation of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Union for the Mediterranean. She has also had several EP electoral elections missions in Ethiopia, Timor-Leste, Sudan, Myanmar, Georgia, among others. She has served in special inquiry committees on the CIA flights on Tax 1 and Tax 2, LuxLeaks scandal, and was vice president of the inquiry committee of the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers, Tax Act 3. She was coordinator and spokesperson for S&D Group of the Special Inquiry Committee on Terrorism, and she was rapporteur for Libya, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the PCA with Indonesia on the EU CVRN action plan, a report on maritime dimensions of CSDP report, on the human rights and corruption report, among other files. She has actively campaigned for the EU Magnitsky Act too. Moving towards her background, she's an academic background in law. She has a long career as a diplomat since joining the Portuguese Foreign Service in 1980 and suspended her diplomatic career in 2003 to enter party politics. She has served as Portuguese missions at the United Nations in Geneva and New York, and also in the embassies in Tokyo and London. And between 1999 and 2003, she was head of the Portuguese interest section and the ambassador in Jakarta, where she played a role in the process leading up to the independence of Timor-Leste and in the establishment of diplomatic relations between Portugal and Indonesia. She was candidate to the presidency of the Republic of Portugal in January 2021, becoming the most voted woman ever in those elections. And she continues her political activism as a campaigner for human rights, integrity and transparency in public life against corruption and organized crime. She keeps a weekly program as commentary at Portuguese TV channel SIC Noticias, and the opinion of Ana Gomes. So again, an honor to have you today with us, and looking forward to your insights in this second panel. And again, very inspiring and powerful speaker. Then Catherine White, we move to Catherine, is a focal point of gender equality and gender mainstream within the Vision for Peace of the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR. Catherine is a gender expert with extensive experience and a demonstrated history of working in academia, policy, and international affairs of gender-related issues with institutions as the European, UNESCO, and HM government. She's a founder and director of Skillsini Productions, a platform dedicated to creating opportunities, changing the narrative, and championing the voices of Black women and girls. Catherine holds a master's degree in high distinction in women's studies from the University of Oxford and a double first class honors degree from the University of Warwick. So we can see that we have a very kind of interesting speakers into this second panel. And as I said, very inspiring. The whole afternoon has been really insightful, and we're looking forward to engage with you. And as I said, we move with Ana Gomez first, and then Catherine, and then I will moderate. I will for sure will be asking you a lot of questions, and we'll bring in those that we have from our attendees. So Ms. Gomez, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lucia. It's really a great pleasure for me to be addressing this seminar and sharing the panel with you, Lucia and Catherine. And it's a particularly extraordinary day for us Portuguese women who care for security and defense, because today we're going to have for the first time a woman defense minister. This is probably being announced now, and it looks like that defense minister is with us, Professor Helena Carreiras. So it's great. It's really special. I'm thrilled. Even more important than that, we discuss the matters that bring us together. And indeed, when dealing with the subject of this panel, implementing strategies to reinforce the gender security nexus, I would try to recall a bit of my experience, because of course we had an extraordinary panel before, namely with all the lessons learned that Valerie was able to give us from her studies and what she's been watching and observing and the conclusions drawn. But I think maybe actually some examples would be also useful indeed to identify what we need to work on strategies to implement these the gender security nexus in practice. And of course, to me, it has been a central piece, the resolution 1325 of the UN Security Council, adopted in the year 2000. It was with that, armed with that resolution, that I actually decided to be a member of the then newly formed Subcommittee on Security and Defense of the European Parliament when I entered it in 2004. And really trying not just to do the kind of work that it's supposed at the national level, but as well to implement it at the multilateral level in the framework of the EU, and reinforce the mutually reinforce this process at the national level and the European level. And it has proven to be a very crucial tool. I would start with how did I think that this was important? I had already learned from my experience exactly in Timor-Leste and Indonesia, how crucial, of course, I was in a way absolutely persuaded that women's rights are human rights. But when you see it at play, indeed in the peacemaking process, or in the middle of the conflicts, and see how it develops and then leads to peacemaking process, it really strikes you how you can't achieve peace without the women. And in this respect, Valerie is totally right to quote Ambassador Chowdhury saying that there is no peace without development, and there is no peace nor development without women engaged. And in East Timor, in Timor-Leste, it was obviously that the resistance, the people's resistance, had never been possible without the women. The women were engaged in the guerrillas, but the women were engaged in active resistance as conveyors of the links between the civilian resistance and the guerrillas. The crucial work that they played throughout these dark years of tough resistance, and then the role they played, not just as victims but as actors for peace, in the process, for instance, to bring back, to repatriate the refugees. Remember, the conflict in 99 meant that about 250,000 people had left, forced many of them East Timor to neighboring Indonesia. And it was then, after a couple of months, it was crucial to bring them back. And the women played a crucial role in persuading the communities they had to go back, and in identifying to the international community that, for instance, some special programs were needed for that, namely for people, enabling people to rebuild their lives, to have, and it was at that time created a fund for which Portugal, Indonesia, and other countries contributed to really enable these, to have some little money and a survival kit to the families returning to Timor-Leste. And it was also the women who played a crucial role in the so-called Truth and Reconciliation committees that were formed in East Timor to heal, to go through, for the accountability on the violence, the bloodshed, and at the same time, the reconciliation process, namely of the communities that had been brought by the militia out of East Timor and then were back, and there were lots of suspicion. So that accountability process that was achieved through a model very similar, inspired in the South African model, the Truth and Reconciliations Committee, would never have been successful without the incredible active participation of women, telling their stories, and indeed leading the community to also oust the pain and indeed move over. And we're talking of a society where women are tremendously repressed, tremendously objects of sexual oppression, not just by the occupiers, and that played a very crucial role, I must say, but on the other hand, by the nature of the very patriarchic society. And I remember, for instance, speaking to Portuguese police women and military who were there after the bloodshed of that year of 99, and who said how crucial it was to have women able to listen to the women who had terrible stories to tell in terms of sexual oppression as part of their liberating process and the liberating process of the society. Then I would like to recall my first mission ever as a member of the European Parliament, which was August 2004 to Darfur, to Sudan and Darfur and Chad, where to visit the refugees in Darfur. The Parliament asked for, we had just been elected in July, the Parliament asked for volunteers to go to the then raging conflict in Darfur to talk to all the parties. And you know what? Only women volunteered, 6 women volunteered. And that delegation was exclusively composed of women. And we went to Khartoum, we went to Darfur, we went to neighboring Chad, we interviewed the refugees. I will never forget the man in the refugee camps in Chad, in the middle of the terrible place, desert. The man asked to meet with us separately, the man. And we had a separate meeting, the 6 of us and our staff, with the man. And they complained bitterly and they exposed all their differences and all their rivalries and so on. And then we decided, of course, we said, now we need to meet the women. And so we met with the women separately. And it was amazing because the women told us how they were extremely busy trying to grow some vegetables out of the desert. They managed it. How they were busy creating schools to put the children back in schools with the teachers and the people minimally skilled to teach something to the schools. And on top of everything else, how their life was miserable because their husbands, they had to attend to their husbands and they were complaining all the time because they were idle and very depressed. And this for them was the worst part, to take care of their husbands who were very idle and depressed. And I believe, as it was earlier said in the previous panel, that indeed the fact that these women were economically, even in that status of destitution, that is the status of refugees in the middle of an horrendous, terrible desert in a very poor country like Chad, these women had the empowerment of being the providers for the families, the ones that took care of everything, including growing some vegetables for them to eat. Then a couple of days later, I must say, there was another interesting mission. Only women again. We were asked to bring up a mission to go to Ukraine to help secure the gay parade, because they were under attack by the Nazis, by the Nazi groups or extreme right-wing groups. And again, only women volunteered, and we were in the front of the gay parade. This was in 2016. Who had who had some security issues, but no real problem. Duly protected by the police and so on, and the fact that we were there were relevant. But I think it's quite significant that only 3 women, and I don't think that they were gay, but they thought this was about indeed human rights and women's rights, of course. Then Afghanistan, another in 2008, 7 years after the West was in Afghanistan, so to say. Big missions, NATO, PRTs, or, and of course, EU helping with the training of the police and UN. What do we find out? That the majority of the people in jail in Afghanistan in that time were women. Women? Were they the ones that were supplying the most of the combatants, the terrorists, and so on? No, these were just simple women who had been caught in the streets because they were said to be vagrants. These were women escaping oppressive families, oppressive husbands, and who were running away and had no house, no way to, and they were caught in the streets and put in jail. And it was really shocking for us to learn from the police, EU police mission, that despite all this heavy presence of the West in Afghanistan, they had not managed to change that. And there was no real active policy to change that at that time. And unfortunately, I don't think that things got better. And we know what later and even last year occurred. Then I would like to recall to you the situation in Iraq during the Daesh, and a visit we had to Erbil and Dahuk, interviewing young women, Yazidi young women who had been made slaves, kept as slaves in Mosul, then managed to get released by in some way. And they were there telling their horrendous stories and how mortified they were to have to do it in front of man. And how it would be much more, they asked us to just tell the story in front of women, and how you actually need to have people from the armed forces, the police, the magistrates, who are properly trained to listen to these kind of stories and to help these people, even for the sake of accountability, whatever. And you cannot, just think that in a situation of conflict, only men can face what they have to what is necessary in terms of security. I could recall as well the situation in a mission, the first EU Common Security and Defense Policy mission in 2006 to DRC, Congo, which was actually made at the request of the United Nations to help secure the environment for the elections to take place. The Americans decided that it was not of their interest to be there, to go there. And it was left to the Europeans to do the job. Not all Europeans were keen to do that job, but since there was the UN request, we really pressed in the European Parliament for that mission to be built and deployed. And I remember going to the provisional headquarters in Potsdam and having a French general was going to command the mission, saying, well, you know, they have decided to assign us for the first time a gender focal point. It was the first time that a gender focal point was being put in a CSDP mission. I don't know what that is. We are waiting for a Swedish colonel, a woman colonel to come. I don't know what it is, but let's see. Well, a couple of months later, we went to Congo to meet with him and the other officers of that mission, and everybody was already very clear about how useful that gender focal officer was to help train men and women in the mission about the sensitivities of the population, about the needs of more than half of the population they were to deal with, which were women, of course, about how to gather intelligence information from them, where of course women were much more suitable to establish their own channels and get a lot of more stuff than men could, and also impart proper information about the objectives of the mission. And when there was a need, and there was at some point for deployment of a tough deterrent group of military in the streets to keep the peace, there was a stunning battalion, or I don't know if it was a battalion, a contingent of Spaniards, women military, who did an amazing job like any other contingent. So for all sorts of tasks that a military peacekeeping mission was called for, men and women were perfectly able, and I would say that women had much more additional assets than men in terms of the communication with the population. And this is exactly what we had heard already from our officers in the Bosnia mission and also in Kosovo. Let me tell you about Libya. Libya, 2011, 2012. Libya, the revolution in Libya and Benghazi was started by women. Nobody talks about that, but they were the ones who really were there to claim their women's rights, their human rights as women. And some of these, and then of course, when Libya turned a proxy war with many players, regional players involved, we could see, and they could see and complain about the fast shrinking space for women who had played such a crucial role in the overthrow of Gaddafi, in claiming for the overthrow of the horrendous regime of Gaddafi. Then the space started shrinking for them once he was gone, because of all these players, you know, from different regional powers, namely, who had a political agenda about suppressing women's rights. And they could feel it. And of course, one of the most vocal women calling for the democracy and human rights was murdered, brutally murdered, Sawa Bughaigis, exactly as an example. Nobody talks about her husband who was also murdered, because everybody knew that the icon to be annihilated was Sawa Bughaigis, because of her leading role in calling for democracy and human rights, therefore women's rights. I would,
sorry to interrupt you, like it's just for allowing Catherine to
okay.
her time. So if you could wrap up.
I
Yeah,
will,
we're
I
in
will,
the,
I will wrap up. Just saying, I could give you a lot of more examples, but indeed, I will just say we need, for these implementing strategies, we absolutely need to understand this is not just about numbers. Numbers are absolutely important. But numbers are important to ensure that there is a mass critique where the view of women, the perception of women, the assets that women can bring to the efficiency of the mission really are taken in consideration. To me, more important than, of course, the points that are relevant about human rights, women's rights, equality, it's indeed the efficiency of the mission in terms of security and defense or whatever the context. And for that, women are particularly suited, and especially in terms of security and defense, the kind of threats we face today, when we have new areas that require special expertise like hybrid war, cyber war, cyber defense, protection of critical infrastructure, space war. Absolutely, women have brains as able and skilled as men, and absolutely necessary. We can't afford to waste them anymore in any security forces, in any security apparatus and armed forces anywhere in the world. And here we are seeing this happening at play in Ukraine. The women are amazing in all areas, being part of that incredible brave effort to indeed defend their country and therefore defend democracy for all of us. So I would just like to say, yes, women can have a special sensitivity. For instance, when we again, the Inquiry Committee on Terrorism that we conducted in the European Parliament, I think it was the first time that we really focused on the victims and heard the victims and heard how our governments were so keen to jump when there is a terrorist attack to show that they're doing everything, but then they neglect the victims, and many of the victims are women, and they told us horrendous stories. So that inquiry committee came out with a lot of recommendations on all aspects, including the victims, and I cannot assure you that it was because there was a majority of women again serving in that committee on terrorism, and we did not neglect hearing the victims and understanding what goes behind the headlines once the terrorist attack occurs. I think that kind of sensitivity is really important, and that's the women who have it and not the men. And I would say I've talked a lot about situations where women are victims, but I have also talked about situations where women are actors, and that is what really we need to stress here. We need women as actors, women in sizable numbers getting a mass critique, and the different policies, different perspective, and therefore, be it in the armed forces, be it in the police, be it as diplomats, providing, all these mediators and so on, but also magistrates, and first and foremost, politicians to have, let me tell you, balls and do the right thing.
Thank you so much, Ms. Gomez. I think that we could be sitting here the whole afternoon listening to all your experience and really very interesting kind of views on the role that women has played. As I said, we have a lot of questions coming through to ask you once we move on. But initially, maybe a thought in terms of this idea of a stereotyping women and giving us that kind of role that we have to accommodate to certain roles, and that others are not for us without actually asking us. So with this, I give the floor to Catherine, and looking forward to hear to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Ms. Gomez, for this inspiring and powerful and rousing intervention. I feel the same. I was just getting swept away in listening to you speak and actually quite forgetting that I had anything to say as well. But actually, I think I'm going to speak a lot to what you've said, and it's going to hopefully complement some of that as well. So thank you and good afternoon, everyone who's here. It's such a pleasure to be part of these really enriching discussions. It feels as though this is some new territory being covered here, where we're actually kind of taking this conversation further and really thinking about the future we want to see, as I think one of the panelists said earlier. So very quickly, just thank you to UNITAR, thank you to the NDI for inviting me and for organising this event. This is much needed, I think. And I'm really excited to be part of it. I think we have this virtual room of really distinguished leaders and thought thinkers and people who are really committed to going further and taking this kind of unique approach, I suppose, to security and development nexus, where we're actually just saying that gender has to be placed at the heart of it, and we have to take this human-centered approach. I was just writing down, Ms. Gomez, you know, what goes behind the headlines. It's this human-centered kind of sensitivity and nuance that women and diverse groups are bringing. So for me, that in itself is really exciting, because it means we can reframe the conversation. So actually, I think this conversation today is also an opportunity, because it's about how do we encourage women? How do we encourage people of different genders, people from diverse backgrounds and intersecting characteristics? How do we kind of encourage everyone to take back agency? How do we work in a different way, working with soft laws, encouraging local communities to take ownership? It's these sort of questions that I'm really interested in, and that I see is the way this discussion has been going today, which is very exciting. So I think also, to put that in another way, how do we ensure that the focus is on the root causes and the underlying issues that kind of create these crisis situations, and not simply a response to those situations? So I guess that's saying, how do we think more long term, and how do we embed gender right at the heart of this? And I think also, just a little note before I kind of go any further, just that whenever I'm speaking about gender, I'm always coming at it from an intersectional point of view. So I'm thinking about how gender systems are always bound up with other identity characteristics, whether that is age or disability or migration status, class, race. You know, it has to be this really broad and inclusive consideration of different groups of people, because of course we have different needs, we have different vulnerabilities, but we also have different capacities. And I think it's kind of focusing on that as well, and looking at how different groups experience security and how they kind of understand and are able to contribute to that. And also, Ms. Gomez was just focusing as well as kind of how women are marginalized. They are also actors. And I think that's a space that I want to focus on today as well. So if we think of security as kind of a focus on protecting people and also promoting peace and development, then for me, it's about thinking about the different ways that people are able to access this, and kind of how does that interact with the gender dimension. So we know that gender equality is the #1 predictor of peace, the #1. There is no greater predictor of peace than gender equality. And I don't think that necessarily reflects peace processes and the security and development nexus that we see. I mean, to give one example, in 2018, there was a $1.8 trillion arms trade. And that same year, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom calculated that the global feminist movement had approximately the same budget as one F-35 fighter plane. So we're looking at around $110 million. So, I mean, how and where do we begin to tackle these really structural obstacles to gender equality and peace? I think we really need to kind of go right back to square one, and we need a power shift that re-centers work on equality and development and peace around the voices of women and of people of different ages, young people, elderly people, people of different races. We kind of need to go back to those who are most affected by conflict and those who are most marginalized by it, and not just kind of look for technical fixes, but to actually look for structural transformation. And I mean, as has already been alluded to by our brilliant speakers, a really good starting point for this is just moving away from focusing on women as victims, and instead focusing on them as actors, and using conversations such as this to ensure that we're really actually opening doors for considering how women and other diverse groups are actually driving peace. You know, traditionally kind of studies and policies about gender in the kind of context of conflict and peace have focused pretty exclusively on the impact of conflict on women or on girls or on children. And we've kind of followed this victimhood approach, which, yes, of course, is important. It's an acknowledgement of the increased challenges that certain groups face in conflict settings. We need that. But I think that doesn't paint the whole picture. And it's coming back to this human-centered approach that we keep speaking about, and really acknowledging the kind of humanitarian, the economic, the social issues that are really interrelated with, well, in fact, inseparable from, you know, issues of inequality and of poverty and injustice. And I think security really has to mean far more than just the absence of conflict. You know, we have to come back to people, and right at the heart of people and human security is gender equality, or actually possibly even just equality in its most inclusive sense. Equality is central to security. So I think, yes, it's about moving away from focusing only on the impacts of conflict and really looking at the drivers. So we really need to see kind of how gender norms themselves might contribute to fueling conflict, or on the other hand, to actually promoting peace. So, I mean, what if we consider a norm, something that's really familiar to us, such as, for example, the concept of war or the concept of peace? And what if we then change how we understand war or peace to really include the everyday lived experiences of people and of gender, how it's performed and policed and constructed in conflict spaces? So if we kind of come back to what I said earlier about intersectionality and look at actually the notion of security and insecurity itself being bound up with gender and with language and with culture and with how we live, I think it's quite interesting, because then we can kind of take peace, for example, and rethink it. So peace then doesn't necessarily mean just a kind of ceasing of hostilities. It then means the satisfaction of all human needs. So this could include comprehensive safety for women, or the right to a seat at the table for example, the gay people in Ukraine that Ms. Gomez spoke about earlier. You know, it's really redefining that and looking at power relations and saying these are actually really significant causes of war. So therefore, we need to transform how we live gender. And if we change the way we live it, we're kind of building our own really significant resource of peace. But then that sounds quite complicated. I mean, how do we live gender in a better way? How do we kind of implement strategies to reinforce this gender security nexus? And I loved what Monica said earlier when she spoke about well-being and how we kind of frequently overlook that as an important factor in participation. You know, we kind of don't afford women these same basic rights as we afford men. So I think that has to come into play as well. It's emergency needs, and it's needs that arrive in crisis. These are just symptoms of underlying issues. They're issues that make people and make societies vulnerable in the first place. And so a more effective international response has to actually address these root causes. And there are so many ways that we could live this. I mean, participation, we have to come right to the heart of this. We need to allow and encourage women and diverse groups to participate and be right at the heart of it. And that is not a kind of favor. It's actually essential for improving performance, for enhancing outreach, for enhancing critical evaluation in missions, in governments. It promotes peace and security and democracy as much, it's as crucial in preventing war and conflict as I think long-term peacekeeping and peace-building programs are. And, you know, we've also heard about some of these skills in, for example, cybersecurity, but women's skills can bring together specialization and negotiation and diversity and all of these really precious capacities in the international security field. So when we're talking about participation, which of course has become an overused word in many settings, we're not offering it as a favor. We're offering it as something that is crucial to improve the effectiveness of missions and the effectiveness of policies. And I think some of the work that I see my colleagues doing at UNITAR is really inspiring, which promotes that. And we've got our pre-deployment training team, for example, they systematically mainstream gender in all of their peacekeeping activities now, and they're working to really emphasize gender sensitivity. So we spoke earlier about focal points, for example, and what that does in just kind of underlining really simple values of respect for diversity and professionalism and raising awareness on the issue of sexual harassment, zero tolerance for abuses. These are just kind of, it seems as though it should have been thought of before, but they really contribute to providing productive and safe working environments for women peacekeepers, but also for male peacekeepers as well, who can really benefit from learning that. And I think that's a sort of example of what we need to focus on, which is really promoting this within the military context, but then also take a step back and how do we promote opportunities from the ground up as well. You know, it's about persistent promotion of gender equality in military and civilian institutions. Yes, making sure women have operational experience. Yes, getting them into top positions, but then also getting a process in place right from the very beginning. So at every stage, we're really encouraging and actively building women leaders and seeing gender equality as central to national and international security and making no excuses for that. I think also though, with all of this in mind, building a world that kind of works for women is not just about saying, okay, here we are, here are equal opportunities, let's go. It's actually about ensuring that it's a world that's built by women. So once a woman gets a foot in the door, how do we retain her? How do we keep her there? I mean, it's about being more thoughtful. And I could give a few examples. You know, paid parental leave has to become a reality. And I think Ms. Ferro touched on that also really incredibly compellingly earlier. It also means we need to really actively promote civil rights and gender equality. What does that look like in practice, in a mission, in a government? What does that actually look like? How do we protect communities of sexual and gender minorities, of racially diverse communities? How do we support them with their career advancement opportunities alongside simply saying, here are these opportunities? It's about kind of reaching out and supporting that as it happens. And I think more than that, then, as we begin to strengthen national security and foreign and national policies, we can't just kind of preach objectives abroad, but we have to actually deliver on them at home. And I believe that we kind of have to start with ourselves and start with where we are, and then we're able to look broader and look elsewhere and see. And I think, I mean, another quote, we've had a few quotes, but I'm sure we all know, I believe it was Hillary Clinton who said, human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. And yes, of course. But I think also we can take that one step further today and say, yes, and these rights apply to all diverse groups. And it's this sort of consideration that I think we can really use to expand our understanding of gender and bring about this power shift that will center on the voices of those most marginalized, those who are existing at the margins of society. Let's hear their voices, let's raise them up, and let's really work to transform the way that we understand power and consequently peace. I'll stop there because I want to make sure we have some time for questions. But yes, really looking forward to speaking more and hearing more from you, Ms. Gomez, as well.
Thank you so much, Catherine and Ms. Gomez. So I think if you allow me, and we go back to the theme of our panel, that is, and connecting to Ms. Gomez's final kind of point of politicians have to play a role. So if we ask here, what are the strategies? Like, there is no doubt that women have a role to play and that we are in an imbalanced type of position. But when we look realistically in terms of our world and we see the different countries, the different needs, different level of development, how we enable those strategies, where do we start? Like, in order to say, well, don't look at women as we are different. I think that might be something that is putting us aside when we say women, and then men, like, okay, this is a different type of collective and we're trying our way through. So what are the strategies and who should be doing this in order to make sure that we don't differentiate anymore between like this reality of gender differences, but that we acknowledge and embrace them and say, well, we're on this together. So Ms. Gomez.
I think it's really crucial to appoint women to top positions at all levels, and then of course to invest in training them for even higher up positions at all levels. And of course we should not, especially in the armed forces, and I've been having as chairing this WISE informal group in Portugal, and here listening to many women from our armed forces, from our police, and from our different quarters, other quarters that are relevant in terms of security and defense. Despite the fact there is goodwill, then there is a political objective to promote women and to encourage women in our governments. Definitely, the progress has been too slow, and we see that in the numbers. There was even a reduction in the recent years, and because there is resistance. There is resistance from the so-called old boys network, let's be clear. And anything is used as an excuse not to push women into the front lines in whatever job or capacity. And of course, if they are not in those jobs, then they don't have the qualification and the experience that is supposed for upper jobs. And that's where I think I say that we need politicians with guts, with balls, basically. And I think these days, I mean, when I see, for instance, the kind of commentary that so-called political military strategists or analysts have been making about Ukraine in our televisions, many of them being military men, mostly. I think that those crude expressions of guts or balls really have a meaning, because as if these guys are so much involved in as if it was a game, a power game, as if it was not about life and death for us all, life and death for our democracies, and actually for people, and indeed where the crucial distinction between evil and good is essential, where you have to distinguish between the aggressor and the victim, and you have to take sides. And I think that women in this respect definitely have a different perception that could add to indeed combine with the necessary skills in all kinds of jobs. But for that, you need politicians that have the guts to appoint women. And that's why I'm so pleased that we have finally a woman as a defense minister in Portugal. I'm pretty sure this can help make a hell of a difference. But there will be tough resistance, because we've seen that resistance in every situation. I have seen women who said, well, we applied for this job in that peacekeeping mission in tough conditions, and we're not being sent, with all sorts of excuses. But of course, one major excuse is actually because when you are in that position in a mission abroad, you actually earn more money, and then this is actually going to benefit those who normally have the economic power. So economic empowerment is also crucial, and that's why, for instance, transparency in all these proceedings is also very crucial. But we should not be fooling ourselves. We need absolutely the courage to appoint women, to let them show their competences, acquire new capabilities, and therefore become accepted. It is not something that we haven't seen in other professions. I mean, we here in Portugal, until the Carnation Revolution in '74, and by the way, tomorrow we will have one more day living in democracy than we lived under dictatorship. Tomorrow we will have 48 years and one more day in democracy than we lived in dictatorship. In the days of the dictatorship, women were not allowed to be diplomats or magistrates, judges or prosecutors. Today, in judges and prosecutors, the majority are women, 48 years later. And I'm sure it was not easy for them, but they are now the majority. And this is clearly established. It has to do, of course, with the qualifications of women in general in our country, but it also had to do with this, the courage of these women to apply, to go for the jobs, to get experience and training, proper training, and so on. We need to do exactly that in the armed forces. This can help change a lot. And in my opinion, it can help change a lot as well in the perception how we indeed prepare for security. I think that women in a way are very able to understand what is the holistic meaning of the concept of human security. That involves much more than just so-called hard security, involves indeed development, good governance, and so on. I would say this is where, in the case of Portugal, this is where the crux of the matter is.
Ms. White?
Thank you. Yeah, I think I would just add to this, I always have this phrase, you can't be what you don't see. And I think what we see in this context is lots of networks. As you said, we have these old boys networks. So I think one of the strategies is to create new networks. And when this can include, mentoring programs, and it can include just creating spaces where women coming up can see women who are already there, who can see women who are up higher, and it's about lifting each other. And I really think we have to create our own spaces. And, they don't give you a seat at the table, you just bring up your chair and sit down. And I think that's how it is. So I think certainly creating new spaces and mentorship. I think also reframing the conversation, it's, people don't like to be seen as doing a favor. They see this as they're sort of, oh, fine, we have to welcome women in. Well, no, actually, you're enhancing the effectiveness of the mission, of the operational security. And I think reframing it and saying, you're not doing a favor to anyone by welcoming in a few women, you are actually increasing your proficiency. So I think that's another way that we can really kind of change the conversation and just kind of reframe it in a way that shows the benefits to everyone by doing this. And I think, that those sort of ways of changing this narrative are going to be really, really crucial as we move forward. And as even conversations like this, having these and creating these spaces are really helpful to recognizing the challenges and also the opportunities that are out there.
Thank you so much. As I said, I have a lot of questions coming through. So linking to what you're saying, Danielle is asking us, based in Ms. Gomez's experience in conflicts, how do you think Women Watch experience in comparison to men, and what is the difference when they actually confront the outcomes, the realities of, let's say, the current situation in Ukraine and the Russia confrontation?
Well, I think that we would not get to this incredible situation where little David is definitely winning over Goliath, that we see now in Ukraine, not just in political terms, but even militarily. If the women would not be an absolutely crucial part of those brave actors defending Ukraine. Women in the military, women in the medical professions, in the police, and women in the civil society, namely women part of a very amazing work of providing news to the world of how this conflict is evolving, which is very significant in the raising up of popular support that has been crucial to pressurize European governments, and possibly a little less US, but definitely in Europe, it has been crucial to pressurize our governments to do the right thing. And they're not doing enough, in my opinion. And that is definitely the result of the pressure of the public opinion, touched by what they are seeing directly from the war in Ukraine. And in that effort, women have been amazing. I follow several Ukrainian women on Twitter who are the most extraordinary providers of what is going on. And I think it's quite significant. I was reading about, of course, we all are reading these days about what makes the head of Putin tick. I was reading an interview with a journalist who met with him several times, including in informal circumstances, and who believes that his kind of resentment that the guy feels against the West, and that complex approach that he has about democratic governments with whom he was dealing with and so on, have to do with the fact that he sees as a humiliation the fact that in the US administration, over the years, in the different US administrations, the so-called Russia experts are women. And he feels that having women as Russian experts is a kind of a plot to humiliate him and Russia, because of course of the mindset, which is very retrograde, it's very conservative, is what has been inspiring all these anti-gender policies, so to say, anti-gender equality policies, very nasty anti-gay propaganda, trying to equate the West with decadence because of our approach to human rights, or anybody, despite regardless of the gender or other differences, is of course entitled to basic human rights. I believe indeed that you see, even in our societies, even those countries who are not in the front line like Ukraine is, the people mobilizing for the solidarity networks to welcome refugees and so on are women. Of course, there are as well men, but women are absolutely essential in all that process. So I believe that the case of Ukraine is exactly an extraordinary example that a society would not mobilize if it would only depend on armed men to be defending it. It's a real people's war, the one that the people of Ukraine are engaging against, that aggression, that miserable criminal aggression. And it's a people's war where the participation of women is absolutely central. It's absolutely active. It's not victims, it's actually actors for, indeed, defense of the country, security of us all, and of course, leading to the peace that we will want. And I believe that another element that could be very important to have women more and more engaged in at all levels in a security agenda would be that women understand how crucial is to follow norms, to be in a rules-based world, and to defend international law. To me, one of the most egregious victims of this criminal war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine is actually how it has imploded, the impact in terms of discrediting all the international law architecture that was built after the Second World War. Namely in the context of the UN, the United Nations, because if it is a permanent member, of course, it's not the first time that we see a permanent member engaging in illegal wars, not at all. But the way a permanent member attacks a neighbor, non-member, to whom it was bound by a security agreement, like the one that led to the nuclear disarmament of Ukraine, that fabricates all that outrageous, lying narrative, perfect narrative, to try to pretend that they are denazification, and that indeed the country Ukraine doesn't exist. It's such a blow against the UN that we cannot afford to accept that. We absolutely have to defend and women understand that having rules. And I hope that ultimately this will lead actually to crucial demand for long overdue changes in the efficiency of UN bodies, in particular the Security Council.
Absolutely, Ms. Gomez. I think that you have like sent a powerful kind of message there, and it's a pity that we're just running out of time. And apologies to the attendance that I have, as I said, a very long list of questions here that I wanted to share and discuss with you. But we just, like, I think our session is just finished. So we're back to, I think, Ms. Carreras to move on to the next. So thank you so much. And Ms. Carreras.
Thank you very, very much, Lucia. I would like to just thank all the wonderful speakers, and Ana Gomez and Catherine White right now, who were so kind also to make some references. On that, I would just say that I could not imagine a more inspiring debate, more empowering words for someone or a woman who would eventually step into decision making in defense than the ones we heard this afternoon. It was really wonderful. We are about to close our conference with the closing remarks of Secretary of State Catarina Sarmento y Castro. Although I suspect that the technical problem that is affecting the defense right now might have prevented her from being with us. I will just check and ask whether somebody from the office of our Secretary of State or herself is among us, among the participants, because I cannot see her name, and we've been trying to reach the office and we haven't been able to. So just checking whether she is with us. There has been a problem. I myself am connected in my office, but through my cell phone, because there has been a problem with the service, defense service. So maybe this was the problem. She appears not to be with us. So I will just take this last word to tell you that again, this was an inspiring afternoon. I really thank all the speakers, the chairs, and above all, of course, UNITAR, who is our partner and will be our partner in this will to further also this gender and security nexus into our reflections, our training programs, our conferences, our connection to civil society, our work as hubs for people, institutions, and ideas to meet. Very much as you yourself were mentioning. So thank you all very much. Thank you, UNITAR. Thank you, the many participants who joined us this afternoon, more than 130, I believe. It was a great audience, and see you again in many places, I suppose, where this topic will certainly be among our major concerns. Good afternoon.